In 1892, one steel town in Pennsylvania turned into a battlefield. Carnegie Steel Company sealed the gates, the Union held the line, and a private army came up the river before dawn. This wasn't only about wages. It was about who controlled the furnace clock and who could shut a town off overnight. Someone fired first. By sunset, Wall Street was taking notes for a deal that hadn't happened yet. "Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it." By the time the gates closed at Homestead, Pennsylvania, steel was no longer just metal. It was rail, bridges, skyscrapers, and armor plate. The mills outside Pittsburgh ran like engines that could not cool down because every minute of downtime burned money. That's the world Andrew Carnegie helped build. His business model was vertical integration with one goal: lower costs, higher output, constant reinvestment. By the late 1880s, his holdings were consolidated as Carnegie Steel, and he had purchased the Homestead Works as a key piece in that river system. To see why unions mattered here, you have to see how the mill breathed. Heat moved forward in a chain: steel making, rolling, finishing, shipping. When everything ran right, the place moved on schedules and handoffs. When it ran wrong, it didn't just lose a shift. It ruined heats and turned profit into scrap. Homestead wasn't one building. It was a system of crews that had to lock together under noise, heat, and exhaustion. Skilled men controlled the hardest handoffs, and management needed that skill to keep the tonnage steady. That's why the union here wasn't a background detail. It was leverage. The union was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and it represented many of the skilled workers whose rules shaped output on the floor. In practice, that meant the company could own the furnaces and still feel constrained because the human bottlenecks were organized. For years, the relationship stayed tense but productive. The mill produced, contracts renewed, and the company expanded. Carnegie even spoke in public, like someone who respected organized labor, at least compared to other industrialists. Inside the system, management saw a break. A union contract limits how fast you can change wages, crew sizes, and work rules. In a business obsessed with efficiency, that break started to look like a threat. And in 1891, Carnegie placed Henry Clay Frick in charge of operations, shifting the fight from arguments to enforcement. Frick's position was blunt. He wanted the union's power broken, and he believed the mills were being held back by amalgamated rules. With him running the play, the coming contract expiration in 1892 stopped being a negotiation and became a test of authority. Records and later summaries describe what happened next as a series of moves that made the outcome feel pre-selected. Management demanded wage cuts for hundreds of workers and treated talks like ultimatums. Then the preparations became visible: strikebreaker recruiting, and a tall fence topped with barbed wire rising around the plant like a warning. Frick didn't treat the contract like a negotiation. He treated it like an expiration date. In May 1892, Andrew Carnegie left for Scotland and put Homestead in Frick's hands. Later accounts say Carnegie tried to distance himself, but his messages to Frick were clear on the one point that mattered: win. Homestead's union wasn't weak. The Amalgamated Association had run this fight before, and the work rules at the mill were detailed enough to feel like a second management layer. Frick saw that as the real enemy. He wanted the mill to run faster, with fewer limits, and with wages that moved downward when steel prices moved. So he prepared the plant like a siege target. On June 25th, Frick announced he would stop negotiating with the union and deal with workers individually. 4 days later, he shut down the open hearth and armor plate mills and locked out about 3,800 men. The timing wasn't subtle. The contract was due to expire at the end of June, and Frick moved first. Then the fence went up. A tall barrier ringed the works, topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers rose. Searchlights and rifle slits turned an industrial plant into a fort that locals started calling Fort Frick. The message was simple. This is no longer a workplace. This is territory. The town answered the same way. Workers and neighbors set up watches. They controlled approaches to the mill and kept strangers under constant eyes. They sealed off Homestead from strikebreakers, not with speeches, but with bodies, patrols, and a shared understanding that if the company regained the plant, the Union was finished. Frick had already planned for that. Months earlier, in April 1892, he contracted the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to provide security. It wasn't a rumor in the town. It was an expectation. Everyone knew what security meant when the company had a fortress and the river ran right to the mill gate. Now the move had to be quiet and fast. Frick's plan was to reopen the works with non-union men on July 6th. If he could get armed guards inside first, he could bring in replacements under protection, restart the furnaces, and starve the strike of its only leverage. So late on July 5th, 2 barges loaded with roughly 300 Pinkerton agents were assembled downriver and towed toward Homestead under cover of darkness. They carried Winchester rifles and badges that labeled them watchmen. But the river wasn't empty. The town had eyes on it. Word spread before the barges could land. Families gathered near the water. Armed workers moved into position. The mill sat behind its fence, black and silent, waiting for one sound that would decide the next phase of the war. And just before dawn, the barges touched the shore. The barges didn't glide in like a surprise. They arrived into a town that had been awake for hours. Men were already posted along the riverbank. Some had rifles. Others carried whatever they could. The mill loomed behind the fence, and the water between them felt like the last open door. The Pinkertons tried to land fast. Their orders were simple: get inside the works, secure the gate, and hold it. Accounts differ on the exact first shot, but what's consistent is how quickly it became a firefight. The river turned into a channel of noise, echoes, and panic. From the barges, agents fired toward the shore. From the shore, workers fired back. People ducked behind pilings, rocks, and the edges of buildings. The idea of private security collapsed in seconds. This wasn't a contract dispute anymore. It was a battle over a steel mill. Reports described bullets tearing into the wood of the barges. Men inside tried to return fire through narrow gaps. The Pinkertons couldn't advance, and they couldn't retreat. The tugboats that brought them weren't staying in a kill zone. On land, the crowd kept growing. Not just workers, but families and neighbors who understood what the landing meant. Homestead didn't have to love the Union to fear what happened if the company proved it could take the town by force. Inside the mill, Frick had his own problem. He had built a fortress, but he didn't control the river. The whole plan depended on the Pinkertons crossing that last stretch of water and opening the gate from within. Without that, Fort Frick was a sealed box with no way to restart. As the hours dragged on, the fight became uglier and more chaotic. Some reports say workers rolled a small cannon to the riverbank and fired at the barges. Others mention attempts to smoke the agents out or set the barges on fire. Whether every detail happened exactly as later retellings claim, the picture is clear. The Pinkertons were trapped, and the town was determined to keep them off the property. By mid-morning, there were dead and wounded on both sides. The numbers vary by source, but the fact of casualties is not disputed. For an industrial conflict, that alone made it historic. America had seen strikes. It hadn't seen a private army pinned down on a river like this. Inside the barges, discipline started to break. These weren't soldiers trained for a siege. They were hired muscle with badges, stuck in a floating box under fire. They had no clean victory path, only survival. Then the white flag went up. Negotiations followed on the riverbank. Local leaders, including union figures, pushed for surrender terms. Hugh O'Donnell, a prominent leader in the strike, would later be tied to efforts to manage the crowd and keep the situation from turning into a full massacre. Even so, the mood in town was raw and unstable, and control was fragile. When the Pinkertons finally came ashore to surrender, they were marched through a hostile crowd. Some were struck, some were cursed, and the scene became its own headline. It looked like the town had won. It looked like Frick had miscalculated, but the victory was a mirage, because the workers had won a battle, not the war. Frick still had a lever the town could not match. If private force failed, the next force would be public. And once the state stepped in, the mill wouldn't need barges to reopen. It would reopen behind bayonets and orders. In Homestead, the furnaces were still cold. The fence still stood. And after a day of blood on the river, everyone understood the same thing. The next move would come from Harrisburg, not Homestead. The Pinkertons were gone, but the mill was still locked. For a moment, Homestead felt like it had forced the company to blink. The river landing had failed. The fence was still there. The furnaces were still cold. People in town started talking like the worst was over. Then Frick pulled the lever the town couldn't pull. Within a day, telegrams were moving between Homestead and the state capitol. Accounts described the strike committee insisting the town was calm, while the company insisted the plant wasn't safe. Governor Robert E. Pattison didn't have to choose between the Union and chaos. He chose the plant. On July 12th, thousands of Pennsylvania National Guard troops marched into Homestead. Contemporary summaries describe it as a force large enough to end any illusion of local control. The crowd couldn't block them the way it blocked barges. This wasn't a private army anymore. This was the state taking the town off the strikers' hands. The effect was immediate. The Guard set up positions, cleared approaches, and secured the mill. The fence that had looked like Fort Frick suddenly mattered less, because the real fortress was the line of uniforms in the streets. The mill stopped being a target the town could hold. It became a protected site. Frick moved fast. With the Guard in place, management began bringing in replacement workers. The company could feed them, house them, and escort them, because now the roads and gates were controlled. The only thing the strikers had left was time, and time doesn't win when the other side can restart the machine. Inside the works, the goal was not comfort. It was output. Steelmaking is a chain. You don't partially restart it and call it done. You need crews, heat, supplies, and a schedule. And now Frick could rebuild that chain without the Union at the center of it. Records describe the strike's result bluntly. The strikers were defeated, and the Union's power in steel took a major setback. Outside the gates, the psychology changed. A strike lives on the belief that the company can't operate without you. Once the Guard secured the plant and replacements started moving, that belief cracked. Some men stayed determined. Others did the math. Rent, food, children, debt. The longer the mill ran without them, the smaller the union's leverage became. Then came another twist that made everything worse. On July 18th, martial law was declared in the town, tightening control and draining hope from the streets. The conflict was no longer workers versus company. It was workers versus company, with the state standing between them and the gates. By now, the Steel War had produced a pattern America couldn't ignore. Private force failed on the river. Public force succeeded on the roads. The mill restarted behind bayonets, and the men who had held the line at dawn were forced to watch the furnace clock start ticking again without them. With the guard in the streets, Homestead stopped being a strike town and became an occupied worksite. The mill restarted behind rifles, and that single fact changed the math for everyone watching. Once steel was coming out again, every day the men stayed outside looked less like leverage and more like a slow bleed. Then the conflict shifted from the gates to the courthouse. Records and summaries describe waves of criminal charges aimed at union leaders and strikers. The message wasn't subtle. You could keep fighting, but you would do it while spending money on lawyers, not food. And the longer the case dragged on, the more the strike committee had to manage exhaustion instead of strategy. Inside the works, the company had its own problem. It could not operate forever as a sealed camp. Strikebreakers living on mill grounds were a temporary patch, not a stable workforce. Frick needed permanent replacements, a steady flow of workers who would cross the line without flinching. To get that, he needed the country to stop sympathizing with Homestead. And then a stranger walked into Frick's office. On July 23, 1892, Alexander Berkman, a New York anarchist with no connection to the Union, tried to kill Henry Clay Frick. Reports describe him gaining entry, then shooting and stabbing Frick before being subdued. Frick survived and continued directing the company's response. Berkman was later sentenced to a long prison term. This moment hit the strike like a hammer because it rewrote the story for people who hadn't been watching closely. The Union did not plan it. The Union did not order it. But in the public mind, nuance loses to headlines. The company now had a new frame, not workers defending a contract, but disorder threatening order. You can feel the air change after that. Support began to evaporate. The American Federation of Labor refused to call for the kind of national boycott that might have choked Carnegie Steel's markets. The strike fund weakened. More men crossed the line, first in smaller numbers, then in larger waves as pressure turned personal. Even inside the strike leadership, cracks showed. Hugh O'Donnell, one of the key figures in Homestead, was pushed aside after he suggested returning under the lower wage scale if union men could get their jobs back. That suggestion tells you how desperate the situation had become. The fight was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the loss. By October 13th, the state militia withdrew, not because the strike was resolved, but because the occupation had done its job. The mill was running. The town's control had been broken. The picket line had been weakened into something management could outlast. On November 20th, 1892, the remaining members voted to return to work, and the strike ended in defeat. The Union was nearly bankrupted, and Homestead became a warning stamped into the steel industry. Not a romantic warning, a practical one. If you can hold the plant, you can break the contract. And here's the colder consequence. After Homestead, financiers didn't just see a labor dispute, they saw a lesson in stability. If steel could be made predictable again, it could be packaged, merged, and sold as something safer than chaos. That's why the next chapter of this war doesn't happen on the riverbank. It happens in New York, where a man like J.P. Morgan looks at the steel industry and sees one final problem to solve. After Homestead, the mill didn't feel like it belonged to the town anymore. The gates were still there, the river still ran past the works, but the balance had flipped. The union had proven it could fight, and the company had proven it could restart without it, once the state held the ground. The deaths from that day on the riverbank became the story's stain, and the defeat became the industry's template. Andrew Carnegie stayed publicly tied to libraries and philanthropy, but the Homestead outcome sat behind his fortune like a shadow. Henry Clay Frick kept the machine running and made it clear the old relationship with the union was over. The point wasn't revenge, it was control. In steel, control meant predictable output, predictable costs, and no organized hand on the throttle. In the years that followed, the lesson spread beyond one river town. Skilled steel unions weakened, and the big producers learned they could force the fight onto terrain they could win. Fences, courts, police power, and attrition. Even when workers tried again later, they were trying against a new kind of opponent, one with deeper pockets and a longer patience. That's where Wall Street enters the story for real. J.P. Morgan didn't need to stand at Homestead to understand what it proved. He watched industries the way a banker watches risk. He hated chaos because chaos kills loans, shakes markets, and turns investment into panic. Steel in the 1890s was powerful, but it was also unstable. Too many producers, too many price fights, too much uncertainty about labor, shutting down the furnace clock. Morgan's solution was always the same: stop the bleeding by consolidating the battlefield. By 1901, the consolidation plan became the biggest deal in American industry. Morgan moved to combine major steel interests into a single corporate structure that could stabilize prices, coordinate output, and reassure investors. The core prize was Carnegie's steel empire, still one of the most efficient and feared producers in the country. What happened next is recorded like a financial extraction, not a handshake. Carnegie agreed to sell his steel company to Morgan for $480 million in 1901, then walked away from the business world for good. That sale became the keystone in building U.S. Steel, a corporation so large it redefined what big meant in America. This is the quiet twist that makes the title Carnegie Steel versus Steel Unions bigger than Homestead. Homestead was the blood and river climax, but Morgan's move was the freeze that followed. Once steel was consolidated, labor conflict didn't disappear. It changed shape. A single giant could afford to wait. It could shift orders. It could idle one plant and run another. It could turn a strike from a wall into a leak and then patch around it. So the story ends with two kinds of power standing back to back. In Homestead, power looked like a fence, a lockout, and barges on dark water. In New York, power looked like paper, signatures, and a banker deciding that the steel age needed one steering wheel. And if you return to the mill in your mind, the last image isn't the gunfire. It's what came after. The furnaces run again. The schedules return. The tonnage climbs. But the Union Hall is quieter, and the men who thought they could bargain with the furnace clock learn that the clock has a new owner. The war didn't end with a handshake. It ended when steel became stable, and stability was built on the memory of what happened at Homestead. Like the video, subscribe, and comment, where are you watching from? This is where we turn America's biggest industries into stories you can actually feel. If you watch the video to the end, would you ever step inside that mill at dawn?